Hi all, Dr. Clark here, Natural Resource Lecture Series, and today we're going to talk about data analysis. Right? And I know that just the term data analysis and a picture like a graph, either a line graph, column graph, whatever, scares some of you because the word math comes up in your mind, and you're like, man, I hate math. Okay. Well, the one thing that I can say is statistics is not math. Okay? Now, statistics uses math, but statistics and data analysis is also more than mathematics. Okay? It's explanations that are based on numbers. Okay? And we'll get to this when we start analyzing our own data. Okay? It's statistics is not cut and dry. There's not always just a right answer. Okay? A lot of times with statistics, there will be clauses that say, based on this data, the results show this. Okay? And that's because it really depends on the experimental design, which we'll get into, and the data that's collected, and then the type of analysis that can be done. Okay, so remember that not all data analysis is just means and averages and standard deviations and t-tests and ANOVAs and all these things that you've probably heard of when you think of data analysis. Okay? There are other types of data analysis that are not as concrete and more flexible, okay? But tell individuals like ecologists, in many cases, it tells them a lot more about the data set. Okay? So let's jump into it real quick. There are two books that I would recommend from the standpoint of statistics. Now, there are thousands of stats books out there, but one that I think for an individual that is scared of statistics, or maybe you've had a stats class and you struggled with it, or maybe you've been avoiding statistics because you're afraid that it's a bunch of math. Statistics Made Simple is an excellent book. It not only presents equations, but it presents equations in word form too, and so and I think it makes the equations a little bit easier to understand. This is just my opinion. I mean, it's been a while since I've looked at Statistics Made Simple, but when I was, overwhelmed by some stats classes that I had, I had forgot a lot of basic principles of statistics, and it was a good review for me. And then I've had students of mine use this book um, to make their stats class a little bit easier, and gain a little bit more knowledge from it. Now, the next one I would say, if you're going into the field of ecology or environmental science, or you're going to analyze a bunch of data, this is the book to get. An analysis of ecological communities. Um, this is by far, and I have taken numerous statistics classes at the PhD level, at the master's level, and at the undergrad level, and this is by far my favorite book when it comes to usefulness in a statistics environment, and usefulness to tell you when you should apply certain methods of stats to your data set. Okay? Now, I know some of you are like, man, I just need to get through natural resources. But at some point in time, you probably will have to have a statistics course. And I think either one of these books, if you're going into the hard sciences, I would say Analysis of Ecological Communities. Even if you're going into chemistry or physics or engineering, this is an excellent book to give you some of that statistics that is very applied, and you will utilize these applications. Okay, and Statistics Made Simple if you're going into nursing, if you're going into business, if you're going into any of these other fields, this is a book that could really help you in your ventures towards whatever career it might be. Because every career is going to use statistics in some way, and to know what people are talking about, or to be able to present the stats yourself, it's a great deal of confidence that you need to build in yourself. But it's better to know what you're talking about than to go in not knowing and then make mistakes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about statistics in general. Um, Again, we left off, we were talking about probability, or the chance that an event would occur again. Okay? Most statistics, when we're talking about just general statistics, is based on probability, or explaining the probability in different ways. Okay? And so many general statistics courses, many general statistic um, analysis systems and experimental designs from a very simplistic point of view are going to be probability based. In other words, they're going to have what we call p-values, okay, where you might calculate a p-value, and that p-value is your probability value, or your value, okay, that would be presented as, this is my value by chance, okay, or outside of this value is how much chance we would expect for these results to occur, okay, purely at random. And like I said before in previous lectures, in the field of environmental science, natural resources, fish and wildlife management, these fields, which I would consider, and most people consider, ecology-based fields, the p-value, or your alpha value, is normally somewhere around 5%. Okay, so we normally state this as, you have 95% confidence in your data, and you have 5% error ratio, or a 5% error in your data. Okay, so you use an alpha value. Okay, when you're talking about statistics, you use an alpha value of 0.05. Okay, or 5% error. Okay, and this is just a rule of thumb. Okay, for ecology-based experiments. And now, some of you who might be going into psychology or sociology, your alpha value is going to be normally higher than that 5% range, because you're dealing with people. So you might accept something like a 10%, or maybe even a 15%, where you're only 90% confidence, or 85% confident. And if you're going into chemistry or physics or something like that, and you have a much more controlled system where you're titrating stuff in, or you're changing the voltage, and that's it, okay, everything else is set, and you have control of everything else, your confidence interval, or alpha level, is probably less than this. So maybe you're going with a 1% confidence interval, which would mean that you're 99% confident in your data. Okay, and so again, statistics is just based on, at least this premise of statistics is just based on probability of error. Okay, and so again, other things that can affect your confidence, or affect how you calculate your probability, is based mainly on sample size. Okay? And so for a general rule of thumb in ecological tests, we're shooting for a sample size somewhere around 30. That's where most statistical tests will come out to, hey, that's a decent sample size. Okay? Anything less than that, you can have a lot more error by chance. I mean, you can think about this as flipping a coin. Okay? So let's say you have a quarter or a nickel. I don't know if I have anything. Oh, hey, look at that. I have a quarter. So let's say I have a quarter, it's a fair quarter, there's heads, there's tails, okay, and I flip this 10 times. The probability of me getting a heads or a tail is identical. It's 50-50, okay? But I think most people who have ever done this, and you can do it, flip it 10 times, you're probably not going to get 5 heads and 5 tails. Okay? Because the coin will land randomly. Okay? And so based on random event, okay, the coin is not going to hit 5 and 5. Okay? But you increase your sample size and you do it 50 times. Okay? You're going to be pretty close to 25-25. You then flip it, let's say you do it 100 times. You're going to be much closer to 50-50 than you would if you only flip it 10 times. And that's because the air gets spread across a lot more individuals. Okay? And if you were to flip it 1,000 times, you're probably going to be very, very close to 500 and 500. Okay? And that's really how sample size works. Okay? Sample size, the higher the sample size, the less a single air event will, let's put it this way, the less pressure or the less ability a single air event will have to taint your results. Okay, and so if you got a sample size of 100 and you say you have one experiment or one time that you ran the experiment, something was just tweaked, it was wrong. Okay, then that's not going to affect the overall results. Okay? It's just like flipping a coin. Again, if you flip it 10 times and you get 7 heads and 3 tails, you might look at that and say, wow, that's not a fair coin. Okay? But if you flip it 50 times and you get 27 and 23, okay, then you're like, yeah, it's pretty fair. That's pretty close. Okay? A lot closer than 7 and 3. Okay? And so that's kind of the way probability works, and that's why we kind of drive to have a certain sample size. In some cases, it's not possible, okay, to have large sample size, but the larger the sample size, typically the better your results will be because the air is spread across a large sample. And it can have less effect on the overall outcome. Okay, experimental design. Okay, there's lots of ways to design experiments, and there's lots of books out there on experimental design, and like I have one here that I prefer. Okay, so this is called Design and Analysis of Ecological Experiments. So if you're moving into again, if you're moving into ecology or ecology-based fields, that's a good one to pick up. But nonetheless, there are lots of ways to design experiments. Now, almost every single experiment in their design, a good experiment, needs to have some way to control for variables. So you have to have a control experiment. Okay? And the better the experiment, maybe the more variables you're controlling for. So you have less outside influence on the overall experiment. For natural experiments, this can be very difficult. Okay, so you're observing events that have already happened, okay, or you're observing events that are happening. Okay, and natural experiments often they take place in natural environments where you can't control for the temperature, you can't control for the precipitation, or you can't control for other factors like other organisms that might be in that region during the experiment and could have an influence on the overall system. Okay? And that makes natural experiments a little more difficult. Okay? That's not to say that you can't bring a natural experiment in to the laboratory and test it in a more controlled environment. Okay? That would be what we call a manipulative experiment, okay? Where you're trying to set some conditions, okay, to be constant while changing other conditions. Okay, so You're holding variables constant. Maybe you bring an organism in, or you can do it in the field. Okay, so it's not just laboratory studies can be manipulative experiments. Okay, so you're controlling for some variables. Maybe you're controlling for soil type. Maybe you're controlling for precipitation. Maybe you can control for the amount of wind in a certain situation, or the plants that are there, or the animals that are there, or lots of different variables. And then you're allowing for some of the conditions to be altered. Either they can be altered by the experimenter, okay, by the researcher, or sometimes you just want the fluctuation, the general fluctuation of the environment to be altered. So maybe you're looking at behavior of an organism throughout the day. You're not changing the the cycle of the day, the sun movement, okay, the wind speed, these things. But maybe you're controlling for all the other variables. You're controlling for what that individual or what those individuals can encounter. So you control for how many plants or where they're at, or what other organisms they have in that environment. Okay, so manipulative experiments, often a condition is altered while other conditions are held constant. Controlled studies, okay, these are more than manipulative experiments. So they go further than a manipulative experiment in that you're trying to control for as many variables as possible while allowing for one variable to differ between experimental group and control group. Okay? Not that they don't happen in a wild setting or in a natural environment. They're difficult to carry out in a natural environment. Now, sometimes it can be done, okay, with different lighting, or setting up your own mesocosms and things like that, which are your own basically ecosystems, and changing a variable in each one of those ecosystems while everything else is held as constant as possible. Okay, these are controlled studies. These are very powerful studies because by limiting the amount of variables that can change and changing one variable at a time, you can get a much clearer picture of the effect of that single variable on the outcome. When we start looking at experiments where we're trying to test, single variables, but we don't want any researcher bias, we'll do what we call a blind experiment. Okay? And often this is done with drug studies or with behavior studies and things like that. Even with like studies where we're looking at whether or not an individual can learn something. So maybe intelligence studies, psychology studies, sociology studies. A lot of times these are blind experiments because you don't want the researcher to give away the answer. Okay? You don't want the researcher to bias the results at all. So often the researcher is blind to which group is being treated and which group is the control group. Okay? And it's not until you start analyzing the data that the researcher knows which one was control and which one was experimental. And this is things like placebo pills and legitimate pills and things like that. We often do blind experiments in medical fields so the researchers can't bias the results. Some other things that occur, and blind experiments are double-blind experiments. They kind of fit together in that medical and psychology and sociology fields, and occasionally in chemistry and physics, and even in biology when we're dealing with behavioral data and things like that. It's nice to have blind experiments, or even if you can do double-blind experiments. And that's when we're talking about a system or experiment that has been set up where the researchers don't know who the experimental group is or who the control group is, and the subject doesn't know who the control group is and the experimental group. A double-blind experiment, on an animal is almost always possible because the animal, most of the time, the animal doesn't know that they're being studied, so they wouldn't know that they're in the experimental group to begin with, or a control group. But for people, okay, this is often the case that psychologists, sociologists will use these to try to prevent as much influence or bias even from the individuals that are being researched on the subject matter or the end result. Okay. So from those experimental designs, you can analyze data in a couple ways. Okay. Often people will just take their experimental design, they'll get their numbers, they'll get their raw numbers, and then they'll start using parametric statistics. So they'll start calculating whether there is a significant difference between one group and another group based on probability. Okay? And this is perfectly fine approach for a lot of fields because a lot of the data will be considered normal, okay, which means it fits a normal bell-shaped curve, and you have equal variation or close to equal variation and whatnot. But a lot of times when we start talking about environmental studies, when we start talking about ecological studies, behavioral studies, okay, studies that are very important for natural resources, okay, models have to be designed, okay? And so these would be statistical models that are a little bit different than per se just calculating whether or not two things are different, statistically speaking, okay? These are predictive models. So if A and B and C occur, then D will occur, okay? And that's, from a ecologist or from an environmental scientist or natural resource manager, that's exactly what you want, okay? You want to try to develop a model, okay? And sometimes this is a model organism, okay? So things like guppies and mice and elegans, and there's tons and tons of model organisms out there that we use because we know enough about them that we know their normal behavior, and we can see how they deviate from that normal behavior. And we know their normal physiology, and we see how they deviate from that. Okay, but there are lots of types of models. Okay, mathematical models, physical models, so you can actually build a model so you don't have to keep dissecting the organism, or you build a model of an ecosystem and how energy flows in and flows out, but it's just a model, a plastic model, metal model, paper model, whatever it is, okay? But it shows, it's a better representation than trying to figure it out without anything. But back to the model selection, or back to statistical models, okay? This is where ecology and environmental science and natural resource management really utilize some of these statistical models, because their study is too complex and there's too many variables to control for. So instead of controlling for the variables, you just analyze the variables. You just collect the data on those variables, and you can put them into a model, and then based on things like model selection, which we call, there's ways to rank models, which we call Akiaki's information criteria, or log likelihood, or Bayesian statistics. There's ways that you can analyze these models to see how valid the model is. Okay? And we'll come back to all this. I know that some of you are like, I don't know what the heck he's talking about. Okay? But again, models are just ways to look at a big picture, okay, by knowing little teeny pieces, and then you're just merging them all together to look at the big picture, the big effect. Okay? And different scientists and different groups, depending on what they're putting in their model, they have different models for different situations. And so let's say you're creating a climate change model based on ocean temperatures, okay, and the acidity of the ocean, carbon dioxide, amount of coral reef, okay, the flow or the waves patterns and the tide patterns and the amount of fish and all this, and then someone from a terrestrial environment is looking at a rainforest model for climate change, and they're looking at organisms and tree growth and precipitation, etc. And then someone else is looking at a rangeland model, and they're looking at the grasslands and their growth and the organisms and the temperature and precip and everything like that. Now, when all these different models agree that the environment's temperature is increasing, then it gives scientists this confidence that, hey, something's going on and it's at a global level versus just a very individual or a very small place on the planet. Okay? And we'll look at some of these. Okay? Which brings us kind of to the systems part of analysis. Okay? And so systems are really can be very, very complex or very simplistic. It just depends on what system we're looking at and what's the overall goal of analyzing the system. Okay? And it can be anything from carbon through a system, nitrogen through a system, and it's just a way to track the movement of certain things throughout different parts of the system. Okay, so maybe you're tracking carbon from the atmosphere into plants and then into animals and then into the soil and then back into the atmosphere. That's a system. Okay? You can do the same thing with energy from the sun into plants, into animals, into a different animal, okay, and on until that organism is dead and it goes back into the decomposers or the worms and other things, columbella, these other things that would decompose. Okay? We'll look at them. Okay? But a lot of the systems are very central to the study of environmental science, because if we know the system, if we know how much energy is going in, and we know how much energy is coming out, okay, we can know where the pitfalls are. Okay? We can know where energy is escaping as heat. Okay? But we can also do this with water. We can look at a water cycle or a water system, okay? A phosphorus system, a nitrogen system, carbon dioxide system, and we can know what's being added from certain sources, okay? And where is certain material being taken up and captured or sequestered even and held on to by certain environmental pieces. Okay? So there's lots of examples of systems. You can look at it. Ecosystem analysis, food chains, climate systems, geological systems, economic systems, so where's the money flow in the system, social systems, okay, in some aspects, just looking at social hierarchy will give you an idea of who gets to vote, who is most affected by environmental change, basically who's the group that gets the burden of the environment or faces the burden of environmental change first, and these kind of things. These would be a social system when you're looking at humans. Okay, so pretty simple. Most of you have probably dealt with many systems before and understand how they work. Here's just a really simple system of tracking photons or free energy from the sun through the system. Okay, so a plant does photosynthesis, captures photons, creates, I shouldn't say creates, combines carbon dioxide and water and oxygen and utilizes phosphorus and nitrogen to combine these molecules into what we call carbohydrates, sugars mainly, okay? And then things like rabbits would consume those sugars, okay, and combine those to maybe make fats and proteins and some sugars too, some glycogen, long stored sugar, or long stored sugars in the muscle of the meat, and then a fox might predate a rabbit, and on and on and on, and this cycle just keeps going. Okay, but where do we have pitfalls? What happens if the rabbit population is removed? Right? What happens to the ecosystem? What happens to the state of those variables? Okay, and we'll look at this when we analyze things a little in more detail later. So systems can either be closed or open. Open means that it exchanges matter or energy with the surroundings. Okay. Closed means it's self-contained, and that material is not exchanged with the outside. And we'll look at some of these systems. Okay, most systems are open, but some systems have a big closed loop, and it's hard for material to get out of those loops. Okay, because of situations that humans have made, but the system is still open. It's just it takes longer for them to get out. So we'll talk about closed loops and things like that. Throughput is, typically a measurement of how much energy or how much material is going in, and then how much is coming out, and what escaped, and where did it escape, etc. And then we'll talk about positive feedbacks. Okay, so this is situations where material is coming in and it leads to an increase in the material coming in. Okay? Or a negative feedback where material comes in, but a feedback loop happens to stop that material from coming in. Okay? Or it suppresses that material from coming in. Okay? Whether this be energy or carbon dioxide or oxygen, or there's lots of systems where there are negative feedbacks and positive feedback loops. Okay? The stability of a system, okay, we'll approach these, and I'm really just giving you out some definitions because a lot of times we'll talk about homeostasis or equilibrium, and I just want you to know in general what I'm talking about. Okay? Now, homeostasis does not mean like completely the exact same over time. What it means is a stable system. So, and most systems fluctuate. So, you might have a temperature profile in the system that fluctuates and goes up and down, or a salinity profile that goes up and down in lake systems. So just in general, homeostasis, we often think of it from a human standpoint of like our body temperatures at homeostasis, but a lot of what we talk about when we talk about homeostasis is actually just maintaining a stable state, but within a certain range. So different organisms have different temperature profiles, but ecosystems have different temperature profiles and things like that. Okay? So then if we look at disturbances will often happen that might change the homeostasis, okay, or destabilize the equilibrium within an ecosystem. Okay, the change can be permanent, okay, or it can just be a one-time kind of change, and then things go back to normal or back to equilibrium. Sometimes it changes permanent and a new equilibrium is developed. Resilience is the ability for the system to recover and return to its normal equilibrium. Different systems have different capabilities. Okay, so if you look at things like Wyoming sagebrush steppe, okay, and you look at trails that have been made through the sagebrush steppe, okay, that the resilience of the soil to snap back to its equilibrium state is not very good. I mean, given that you can still see today the wagon wheel marks from the Oregon Trail as it moved through Wyoming. It's still present today. You still can see it. That means that equilibrium was broken due to the disturbance, and a new equilibrium was created. Okay? So the resilience is not very good for it to recover its original state, and a new state has to be created. Okay, and that's what we call a state shift, or when a disturbance is big enough that the variables in that state change. Okay? And so a new equilibrium is made. Okay? So sometimes this is detrimental. Other times it's maybe an eyesore. Okay? But sometimes if the ecosystem doesn't snap back, the ecosystem changes permanently, then the organisms that required that homeostasis of that ecosystem, they'll go extinct, or will have to migrate out of the region. Okay? And so here you can kind of see that some of those systems and how they work. Okay, photons come in, photosynthesis, plant grows. Okay, plant might feed fish biomass, so if it's an aquatic plant like Elodia or something like that. Okay, the fish defecates and produces carbon dioxide. The plants take in the nutrients, the excess nutrients from the fish biomass, creates more plant biomass, consumes carbon dioxide, feeds the fish, and gives them oxygen. And this is how this system just keeps going. Right? Now, as we progress in a system, we'll pick up what we call emergent properties. These are properties which we don't see at individual levels. So maybe if we're just looking at a tree species or grass species or a fish species, you wouldn't see these characteristics. Emergent properties are properties that come about as you look at the whole system together. We'll come back to this. Okay? Consensus and conflict. Scientific consensus is really when majority of the scientists agree about a certain situation, about a certain finding, okay, or about a certain theory, okay, or a certain explanation for a natural phenomena. Okay. And the great thing about the scientific community when they do this from the perspective of primary literature. So individual publishes something, it's scrutinized, okay, and comments are made, and then another individual might publish something else. Okay, if it's in support, okay, then more individuals will start studying that, and you get more papers and more papers and more papers, and it just cumulative amount of information, okay, that you start to get a consensus. Okay, look, there are numerous publications on this, and it all seems to be occurring in the same pattern. Okay? Now that doesn't mean that you can't have what we call a paradigm shift, and that's where what once was an explanation for some natural phenomena, due to new technology, due to better design, something, that explanation doesn't work, and a new explanation is presented. Okay? And scientists agree that the old explanation needs to be, we need to get rid of that old explanation. Okay? And so this is kind of the approach of science in general. Okay? And I'd urge you to look at things where people are calling certain things science. Okay? And this is just 7 key ways to kind of detect pseudoscience or false science. Okay? And this is in the environmental science textbook. Okay, you can pull, how to recognize pseudoscience. If you Google that, they're going to give you a bunch of ways. But there are lots of ways at which you can recognize pseudoscience. And I would argue some of the best ways is to just look at the source. Who's publishing this information? Is it a website or is it a scientific journal? Okay. If it's a scientific journal, the individual who publishes that has to list, okay, any funding sources that they've got. And so most researchers will say, whoa, who's this individual? Who's this politician paying you to do this scientific research? Right? And if that was the case, if a scientist was getting paid by a politician or by a company, and an oil or coal or solar company or wind company, to do the scientific research, then right away that peer-reviewed publication would reject it and say, no, this is a biased study. Okay? So look at who's financing it, look at where it's being published, okay? Look at what the rest of the scientific community is saying. Okay? If this one publication comes out and says, hey, you're wrong, this is not occurring, okay? But there's 2 million publications that says it does occur, okay? I'd be pretty hesitant to go against the 2 million publications for the one publication that says something different. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not right, okay? But I would start looking and validating those sources and validating that information. Okay? All right, so we'll stop there. We'll pick up more on energy, okay, and looking at ecosystem analysis later.